In 1701, a group of 10 distraught ministers gathered in a Branford parlor to erect a theological fortress against the rising tide of liberalism at Harvard. They didn't just build a school, they launched a spiritual counteroffensive, intending to anchor the American mind to the eternal truths of the Reformation. Yet 3 centuries later, the fortress remains standing, while the faith that built it has been systematically evicted, a transformation that serves as the ultimate cautionary tale of how an institution can gain the whole world but lose its very soul. The history of American higher education is, at its root, a history of theological preservation and eventual drift. No institution embodies this narrative more vividly than Yale University. While today it stands as a pillar of global secular academia, an elite bastion of research, law, and liberal arts, its inception was not a move toward enlightenment in the modern sense, but a defensive maneuver. Yale was born from a profound sense of cultural and spiritual crisis. To understand the reason behind its founding, one must look toward Cambridge. By the late 17th century, Harvard was undergoing a liberal drift that deeply alarmed the conservative Congregationalist establishment. Their leadership began to favor a broader, more inclusive approach to divinity that moved away from strict Calvinist orthodoxy. The 1701 Charter was not merely a legal document, but a spiritual manifesto. This was a direct response to the decay of religious fervor observed in the Massachusetts province. Powerful conservative figures, most notably Increase Mather, viewed the new college as a relief against the sorrow of seeing Harvard's traditional orientation crumble. The early years were characterized by a lack of permanence. For its first 15 years, the school lacked a singular campus, housed instead in various parsonages. This decentralized existence emphasized the college's identity as a community of faith rather than a physical landmark. It was only when a permanent campus was established in New Haven that the institution began to take on the physical gravitas necessary to rival Harvard's influence. The founders ensured the curriculum functioned as a filter. Applicants faced special examinations in Latin and Greek, languages essential for the study of Scripture. The core objective? The preparation of youth for public employment both in church and in the civil state, ensuring that the magistrates and ministers of the colony were cut from the same orthodox cloth. To anchor this education, the trustees mandated specific textbooks that left no room for theological ambiguity. The primary text was William Ames's The Marrow of Sacred Divinity, provided a systematic, reformed framework that prioritized the Westminster Standards as the definitive interpretation of faith. Yale was the intellectual arm of the colony's churches. Under the Saybrook Platform of 1708, a semi-Presbyterian governance was established. The trustees viewed this religious education as the chief and most probable expedient for propagating the purity of Protestant order in what they still termed the wilderness. Student life was a totalizing religious regimen. Every student was mandated to attend public prayer both morning and evening, a practice of compulsory chapel that would persist until 1928. The expectation was that personal secret prayer would complement these public duties, fostering a holistic atmosphere of piety. Despite the standards, the early history was not without turmoil. In 1721, a young Jonathan Edwards wrote to his father about monstrous impieties within the college. He described students stealing livestock, unseasonable night walking, and using all manner of ill language. This unrest suggests that even in its earliest phase, the theological fortress faced internal pressure. The struggle to maintain a blameless student body prefigured the larger cultural shifts to come. The struggle for the soul of Yale had begun. The 19th century witnessed a metamorphosis where Yale transitioned from a regional defensive outpost into the mother of colleges. This title was earned by its role as the primary engine for Protestant higher education across a rapidly expanding nation. This era of ascendancy was not a byproduct of luck, but a deliberate strategic pivot. While Harvard explicitly embraced Unitarianism, Yale's leadership chose to lean into a robust, expansionist Christianity. This decision positioned New Haven as the epicenter of a boom period in American education. Between 1800 and 1860, the number of colleges in the United States skyrocketed from roughly 20 to 180. The transformation began in a state of deep cultural malaise. Following the Revolutionary War, the American moral landscape had fractured. The absence of spiritual leadership, caused by ministers leaving pulpits for the battlefield, contributed to a surge in social instability, characterized by rampant drunkenness and profanity. Simultaneously, the intellectual threat shifted from internal denominational squabbles to the external pressures of the French Enlightenment. The philosophies of Hume, Rousseau, and Voltaire introduced a wave of deism and skepticism that many feared would render traditional Christianity obsolete. The primary architect of Yale's 19th century revival was Timothy Dwight, who assumed the presidency in 1795. Dwight did not encounter a passive student body. He faced an environment where infidel philosophy was the fashionable norm. His method was inherently intellectual. Rather than relying on emotional manipulation, he utilized powerful reasonings and lectures specifically targeting the logic of skepticism. Dwight demonstrated that faith could be defended with sophisticated scholarship. He argued that genuine religion must animate the whole person, integrating the understanding with the heart and manifesting as integrity in secular affairs. By 1802, this intellectual groundwork bore fruit in a massive spiritual awakening, where 1/3 of the 225 students underwent a conversion experience. These students did not stay in New Haven. They became agents for revival, who exported Yale's model of Christian education to the American West and South. The nature of these conversions reflected a uniquely New Haven style. It was orderly, subtle, and profoundly psychological. Unlike the frenzied camp meetings seen on the frontier, the Yale experience often began with a quiet, persistent sense of sinfulness, lasting several weeks. This was followed by a silent peace of conscience, so subtle that the individual might remain temporarily unaware that a spiritual transformation had occurred. This influence was codified in the Yale Report of 1818, a landmark document that successfully advocated for the retention of the traditional classical curriculum against calls for more vocational studies. By defending the prescribed classical model, Yale ensured that the intellectual foundation of American leadership remained rooted in the linguistic and philosophical traditions it deemed essential for a Christian magistrate. To further cement its role, Yale Divinity School was formally organized in 1822. Under Nathaniel W. Taylor, the school developed New Haven theology. This modified Calvinism provided the intellectual hardware necessary for the revivalist movements of Jacksonian America, offering a bridge between strict doctrine and a democratic, action-oriented spirit. By the Civil War, Yale was one of the largest colleges in the nation, setting the gold standard for institutional governance through its model of an external board of trustees. Yale was a powerhouse, serving as the primary promoter of intercollegiate football. Yet beneath this peak of national prominence, the very success and respectability Yale had achieved were beginning to sow the seeds of its theological undoing. Success would become the ultimate test of the fortress. The narrative of Yale's transition from a revivalist fortress to a secularized global university is not a story of sudden collapse, but of a gradual exchange. Over the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the institution traded its theological distinctives for academic respectability, ultimately becoming a place where religious forms persisted long after the spiritual substance had evaporated. This transformation mirrors a broader intellectual revolution across the American landscape, where the supernatural worldview was systematically replaced by naturalism and logical positivism. The movement toward secularization was the most pivotal event in the history of American higher education. Prior to this era, almost all leading thinkers operated within a framework of Christian theism. However, as American intellectuals began to follow the lead of their European counterparts, a new value system of relativism took hold. This shift occurred across nearly every discipline, from biology to sociology. At Yale, the authority of Scripture was gradually eroded by the burgeoning scientific revolution and a pragmatic worldview. One of the most deceptive aspects of Yale's decline was how long the outward appearances of piety remained. For the first half of the 20th century, the university continued to project a religious image. Compulsory chapel attendance, a cornerstone of the original 1701 vision, was not officially dropped until 1926. The construction of massive architectural statements, such as the Harkness Tower, served as a symbolic effort to preserve the prominence of religion. From a historical perspective, These grand buildings can be viewed as final compensatory gestures in the face of an overwhelming secular takeover. By the time the cultural pressures of the 1960s arrived, what remained of Yale's substantial religious identity evaporated almost without a trace. The religion that had once been the main business of the university had become peripheral and eventually was seen by many as alien to the educational enterprise itself. The fall of Yale was facilitated by a specific institutional weakness. While the college was highly successful at promoting revivals, it lacked the deep, intentional, rigorous Christian thinking that had characterized the earlier Puritan era. Protestant educators often found that their values aligned too neatly with the surrounding society. This alignment led to a failure to develop a clear Christian critique of their cultural situation. Leaders neglected to push thinking from the scripture to modern situations and back again, leaving the institution intellectually defenseless against the rising tide of secular philosophies. Despite the loss of identity, Yale solidified its position as one of the finest research institutions in the world. But the ministerial focus shifted dramatically. Whereas the majority of 17th century graduates entered the ministry, that figure plummeted to a mere 6.5% by 1900. Today, the atmosphere at Yale is so radically changed that a student from the early 1700s would likely find the current environment unrecognizable. The theological fortress has been fully dismantled, replaced by an elite secular institution whose religious heritage is often viewed as a fabricated or irrelevant tale of the distant past. The transition was complete. The transition of Yale into a fully secular entity was not merely a loss of religious fervor, but the result of a specific intellectual trade-off. As the university sought to compete on a global stage, it adopted a new set of epistemological foundations that fundamentally reconfigured the reason for its existence. By the late 19th century, the figure of the clergyman professor, the polymath who taught physics through a providential lens, was replaced by the specialized researcher. This new breed of academic was often trained in German universities, where the scientific method was applied to history, philology, and theology itself. At Yale, this manifested as a separation of fact from value. The sciences and social sciences began to operate under methodological naturalism. Education was no longer seen as the formation of a Christian soul for service to the Commonwealth, but as the technical training of an expert for a specialized economy. The original Yale vision rested on the conviction that all truth was God's truth, that every subject was interconnected. The fall can be traced through the disintegration of this unified curriculum. As elective systems were introduced to mirror the Harvard model, the prescribed course of study was dismantled. Without a central theological core, the university became a collection of disparate departments. The reason behind the pursuit of knowledge shifted from the glorification of the Creator to the expansion of human autonomy and the mastery of the material world. The university succeeded in becoming a powerhouse of research, but fell from its vocation as a coherent witness to the faith. Yale's status as an Ivy League institution created a unique pressure to conform to the values of the American elite. To maintain relevance among power brokers moving toward a secular worldview, Yale distanced itself from the perceived narrowness of its evangelical roots. The leadership began to view the school's orthodox past as an embarrassment, a wilderness phase the university had outgrown. The 1960s represented a tectonic shift. The Cultural Revolution stripped away the remaining gentlemanly religious traditions. The concept of in loco parentis was abandoned. Moral standards, once rooted in Christian ethics, were replaced by a radical emphasis on individual expression. The religious image, maintained by the Gothic architecture, became a hollow shell, an aesthetic backdrop for a campus culture often overtly hostile to the theological foundations of its founders. The fortress had not been conquered from the outside, it had been hollowed out from within by a leadership that believed the school could remain Yale without the God of its charter. The story of Yale is a cautionary tale of institutional drift. It rose to become the most influential educational force in America, but in its very success, it found the seeds of its undoing. By prioritizing respectability over its foundational mandate, Yale transformed from a light intended to guide the wilderness into a mirror reflecting the secular preoccupations of the modern age. Today, The university stands as a monument to what happens when an institution loses its North Star, becoming a place of immense knowledge, but one that has forgotten the very wisdom it was founded to uphold. As you look upon these towering spires, ask yourself, what are the foundational stones of your own intellectual life? The history of Yale proves that institutions do not drift toward orthodoxy, they only drift away from it. Neutrality is a myth. We must resolve to be intentional stewards of our convictions, ensuring that our successes never eclipse our ultimate purpose. The story of Yale is an ongoing dialogue about faith, culture, and the academy. To navigate these complex waters, you need a resource that refuses to sacrifice theological rigor for modern relevance. Subscribe to Theology today. Don't let your foundations erode by default. Join a tradition of learned, orthodox inquiry that seeks to illuminate the wilderness of our modern age.